By noon, the whole town had gathered, pressed tight around the gallows post that served as a wedding altar whenever the preacher needed to prove obedience louder than mercy. The air was dry, the kind that made every breath sting, and Clara Wren, 22 and trembling, stood barefoot in her white shift with her wrists bound in front of her. Dust clung to her lashes. Somewhere a horse kicked against its stall, as if even beasts could feel the wrongness. Judge Marrow sat high on his chair beside the preacher, his black coat heavy with sweat and pride. "Refusal is rebellion," he declared, voice thick like oil, "and rebellion will be broken." The man she was meant to marry, Elias Boone, stood off to the side, too cowardly to meet her eyes. He had bought her father's debt and her body with it, signing both on the same ledger. When she'd told him she would not be wife to a man who measured love in coin, the town called her wicked. Now she was to pay for it in front of the same neighbors who once bought her sewing with smiles. The preacher lifted his Bible. 10 lashes to cleanse the sin of pride," he said. The whip uncoiled like a snake, its shadow slicing across her bare feet. For a heartbeat, she thought she heard her mother's voice whisper run, but her knees were weak, and nowhere in this town was safe. The first lash cracked through the air but stopped short. The crowd gasped. A figure had stepped forward from the edge of the square, tall and still, his skin sun-browned, his hair bound in a leather tie, his eyes dark as the mountain storm. Toby, the Apache warrior the townsfolk whispered about but never looked in the eye, stood between her and the whip. He didn't speak. He simply turned his back to her and faced the preacher's men. The silence that followed felt like judgment itself holding its breath. "Move aside, savage," the sheriff barked, but Toby didn't move. He unbuttoned his coat and dropped it to the ground, revealing scars older than any law these men had made. The whip came down, striking across his shoulders with a sound that tore through the air. He didn't flinch. The second came, and still he stood. Dust lifted in swirls around them, the world narrowing to the sight of one man who refused to let another soul be broken for saying no. Clara's tears blurred the crowd into faceless shapes, but she would never forget his back, each stripe of blood a vow written louder than any prayer the town had ever heard. The second lash hit with the sound of thunder against stone, and still he stood, broad-shouldered and motionless, his body taking what was meant for hers. The crowd, hungry for punishment a moment ago, now stared in stunned silence, as if they'd just seen a ghost refuse to fall. Clara could smell the iron in the air, the mingled scent of sweat and blood, and something else. Shame. Judge Marrow rose from his seat, shouting for the sheriff to drag the savage away, but no one moved. It wasn't just fear that froze them. It was the weight of what they were seeing. Toby turned his head slightly, just enough that she could see the side of his face through the curtain of his hair, and in his eyes there wasn't fury, only calm defiance. When the sheriff finally lunged, the whip slipped from his grasp, and the tip tore through the back of Toby's shirt again, leaving another red bloom against brown skin. The preacher's lips trembled, half-forming words of rebuke that died before they found courage. "He's taking her guilt," someone shouted from the crowd, and another voice answered, "Then what guilt does she have?" The town's harmony began to crack, whispers turning to questions. Clara's pulse hammered so hard she thought she'd faint, but she couldn't look away. Every strike landed like a nail in the coffin of what this town once believed about right and wrong. The judge, red-faced and shaking, pointed his cane at her. "You see what your pride brings? You've turned men against order." She wanted to speak, to say she hadn't asked for this, but Toby's voice came first, low, firm, the sound of a mountain speaking through a man. "If she sins by refusing chains," he said, "then let me bear her sentence." At least one of us will walk away unowned." His words rolled through the square like thunder finding its echo. No one answered. The sheriff lowered his whip, his arm trembling, his eyes wide with something dangerously close to respect. Rain began to threaten from the edges of the sky, gray clouds swirling over the red roofs, and in that strange half-light, Clara understood something she hadn't known before, that mercy, when it appeared, never came dressed as the gentle. It came as the brave. Toby bent down and picked up the whip himself, holding it out to the judge. "If you'll punish," he said, "then see clearly whom you're breaking." The judge didn't take it. The crowd, one by one, began to step back, as though the fire had turned on the men who started it. No one spoke, no one breathed, and even the horses in the corral fell still as Toby stood before them with the whip hanging from his hand like something holy turned against its maker. The clouds thickened above, dimming the sun until the town square looked like a place forgotten by heaven itself. Judge Marrow's jaw trembled, the power slipping from his face as fast as the color in it. "You'll hang for this," he barked, but his voice cracked on the last word. Toby didn't answer. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, until the distance between them was smaller than the space of a single lie. "Then hang me," he said softly, "but you'll have to tell them why you fear a man who would rather bleed than watch." The judge flinched as though struck. The sheriff's hand hovered over his revolver, but never drew it. Behind them, Clara's breath came in sharp, uneven bursts, her wrists still bound, her eyes wide as the first drops of rain began to fall. They were small, cold, and steady, like tears from a sky too tired to intervene. Toby turned back toward her, his face unreadable, and dropped the whip at her feet. "It belongs to no one," he said. Then he went to his knees, his body shaking from the strain, the blood seeping through the back of his torn shirt. For a heartbeat, the judge thought the moment was his to reclaim. He raised his cane to signal another blow, but no one moved. The preacher lowered his Bible. The crowd that had come to watch a woman broken now stood in the rain, watching a man refuse to let cruelty have the final word. A little girl in the front, too young to know fear, yet old enough to know wrong, ran forward and placed her small shawl over Toby's shoulders. Her mother gasped, but didn't stop her. The gesture broke something deep and silent in every heart there. The judge shouted for order, but order was gone. All that remained was the sound of rain on dust, and the slow, labored breathing of a man who had taught them what justice looked like without saying a word. Clara stepped forward, the wet earth sinking beneath her feet, and picked up the whip. Her hands shook, but her gaze was steady when she turned to the crowd. "If this is law," she said, voice trembling but clear, "then I will not obey it again." No one answered her. The judge could only stare, drenched, defeated, as thunder rolled above like a final verdict he could not appeal. Rain fell harder now, turning the dust beneath their feet into dark red mud, and the sound of it filled the air where shouts had been moments before. Toby was still kneeling, his breath ragged, blood streaking his back in narrow rivers that ran down to his belt and vanished into the earth. Clara stood before him, soaked and trembling, the whip heavy in her hands. For a moment she didn't know what to do with it, whether to throw it away, burn it, or use it against the men who had made it their god. But when she looked at him, this stranger who had taken every lash that should have been hers, she understood that justice wasn't about returning pain. It was about ending its reign. She knelt beside him, placing the whip across her lap. "You shouldn't have done this," she whispered, her voice breaking. His eyes opened slowly, dark and calm despite the storm. "If pain is what they respect," he said, then let them learn to fear kindness." His words struck deeper than any lash could. The preacher, watching from under the chapel awning, finally closed his Bible. The sheriff lowered his hat against the rain and looked away. Judge Marrow, furious and trembling, shouted, "Take them both! Let the town see what mercy breeds!" But his own men hesitated, and one finally spoke. "Sir, they've seen enough." The judge's mouth opened and closed like a fish starved of air, but no one moved to obey him. The rain turned the whip's leather black, washing away the blood until it looked new again. Clean, almost holy. Clara lifted it, walked to the center of the square, and hung it over the post where she had been bound. "If this town needs saving," she said softly, "it will start by putting this to rest." Toby tried to stand, but staggered, and she caught his arm, holding him steady. The crowd's silence deepened. Even the judge didn't dare speak. Together they walked through the square, past the people who had come to watch her punished. Some stepped back in shame. Others dropped to their knees in quiet awe. The rain washed away every footprint behind them, and by the time they reached the end of the street, no one could tell where the captive had stood and where the savior had knelt. Only the whip remained, hanging motionless under the gray sky, a dead thing in a town finally learning how to breathe. The storm chased them out of town, its roar following like judgment made of wind. Clara half-dragged, half-guided Toby toward the old chapel shed behind the ridge, the one long forgotten since the preacher built a new one closer to Main Street. By the time they stumbled inside, the door slammed shut behind them, and thunder rolled so loud it made the walls shake. He sank to his knees, the weight of pain finally catching him, blood soaking the back of his shirt until it clung to him like a second skin. She tore at the seams, ripping the cloth away carefully, her hands shaking but determined. His back was a map of suffering, open welts mingled with old scars, proof that cruelty had met him before and failed to finish the job. "Why would you do this?" she asked, her voice more accusation than question. His eyes were half-lidded, his breath uneven. "Because I was taught a man's worth isn't what he takes," he said quietly. "It's what he's willing to stand between." She pressed her shawl to his wounds, and he didn't flinch, only closed his eyes as if her touch hurt less than the memory. Rain drummed the roof like the sound of 1,000 marching feet, and lightning flashed, illuminating his face, calm, resolute, and so utterly human that she felt her own shame rise like heat. "They'll come for you," she whispered. "You stood against the judge." "He won't forget. Then I'll stand again," he murmured. His voice was deep, roughened by pain but steady enough to feel like a vow. She tore strips from her skirt to bind the bleeding, her hands brushing his skin in careful, trembling circles. "You shouldn't have taken those lashes," she said. "You don't even know me." His lips curved faintly, not quite a smile. "I know what it's like to be alone before a crowd." The words broke her completely. She sat back, tears mixing with rain dripping through the roof. For the first time since her mother's death, she prayed. Not for herself, but for the man who had shown her what mercy looked like when the world had forgotten. As thunder faded into a soft, distant hum, she looked at his still form by the fire and whispered, "Then you'll never be alone again." Outside, the rain slowed, the earth steaming as if the sky itself was trying to cleanse what it had just witnessed. When dawn came, the rain had gone quiet, leaving the world soft and silver, as if nothing cruel had ever happened the day before. A single beam of light slipped through a hole in the roof and fell across Toby's back, where Clara's makeshift bandages clung to drying blood. She watched his chest rise and fall, too shallow, too slow, and felt that strange ache again, the kind that comes when gratitude and guilt live in the same heart. He opened his eyes before she realized she'd been staring. "You didn't leave," he murmured. "You didn't give me reason to," she answered. He tried to sit up, winced, then managed a smile that looked more like endurance than comfort. For a long time, they just listened to the dripping eaves and the faraway sound of wagons starting their morning routes. Finally, she said, "You spoke of standing between... Is that why you came here? To find more lashes to carry?" He looked toward the open crack in the door where sunlight pooled on the floorboards. "Once," he said slowly, "there was a woman who brought food to my people when the soldiers cut off the trade roads. She was a settler, fair-haired, kind. They said she betrayed her own kind for loving mine. The same judge who ordered your punishment gave the rope for hers." Clara's throat closed around the breath she tried to take. "You saw it?" "I heard it," he said. "I came too late." The words fell like stones in still water. Since that day, I swore silence. Words never saved her. I thought they never would again. He shifted, his hand pressing to his ribs. "But yesterday, I heard them call you proud. I saw the fear in your eyes, the same fear I remember from her, and I knew silence had served no one." The shed felt smaller suddenly, heavy with history and rain-soaked wood. Clara knelt beside him, fingers brushing his wrist. "Then maybe you broke it for both of us," she whispered. His gaze met hers, steady and calm, and she felt the ground between them turn from earth into something sacred. "They'll come again," he said. "Not today, but soon." "The judge will not rest. Then neither will I," she answered. Outside, a bird called through the quiet, its voice sharp and new, and the light that spilled across his scars looked almost like forgiveness learning how to speak. By midday, the storm had dried into silence, the kind that made every sound echo like confession. The town below them was restless again, wagon wheels turning, boots scraping against boards, and whispers crawling through windows like smoke. Judge Marrow hadn't forgotten. His pride had been cut deeper than any wound, and men like him bled revenge instead of truth. In the shed, Clara packed what little they had: a torn shawl, a flask of water, a loaf of bread still warm from the church kitchen. Toby sat near the doorway, sharpening a small knife not for battle, but for the calm it gave his hands. "They'll come before dusk," he said, his voice steady but certain. "And if they do," she replied, "they'll find two, not one." He looked at her for a long moment, the corners of his mouth twitching like a man who'd forgotten how to smile. "You owe me nothing," he said. "You gave what's left of your peace to protect mine," she answered. "That's not nothing." The first shout came not long after, riders approaching, the judge's men, their coats dark with dust, rifles glinting in the sun. The preacher trailed behind, his hat low, face pale. Toby stepped outside, his movements slow but deliberate, while Clara stood just behind him, her hand gripping the edge of his torn coat. "Apache," the sheriff called out. "You'll come with us, or we'll burn this place to the ground." Toby's voice carried over the wind. "And what crime have I done?" The sheriff looked to the judge, who sneered. "You dared stand against God's law." At that, Clara stepped forward. "Then God must have gone blind because I saw no law, only cruelty." Gasps rippled through the men. The preacher took a hesitant step closer, clutching his Bible like a shield. "Miss Wren," he began, "you don't understand—" "No," she cut in, "I do. I understand that you all stood silent while one man bled for your sins." The sheriff lowered his rifle, guilt flickering across his face. The judge's voice shook with fury. "Take her too, then!" But no one moved. The crowd from town had begun to gather again at the edge of the ridge. Shopkeepers, mothers, children. The same people who had watched her bound now watched her stand unflinching beside him. Toby's hand brushed hers once, a silent signal of calm. "There's no fight here," he said quietly. "Only truth." His voice carried so steady that even the rain clouds above seemed to listen. "You can strike me again," he told the judge, "but this time every man watching will have to ask himself why." No one answered. The sheriff dropped his weapon. The preacher closed his Bible. And one by one, the men who had come to arrest him turned their horses around. Only the judge stayed, his face pale and shaking, his world unraveling before eyes that finally saw what he had created. A town that no longer believed his version of justice. When the last of the riders turned back toward town, the judge stood alone in the clearing, his boots sinking into the wet earth, his voice breaking as he shouted curses that no longer carried authority. Toby straightened his back despite the pain, his shirt torn and stained from the lashes, and stepped forward until only a few paces separated them. Clara stood just behind him, the wind tugging her hair across her face, her hand clutching the turquoise bead he had given her, as though it could steady the tremor in her chest. The judge raised his cane, shaking it like a weapon, but Toby's voice rose first, low, deep, and steady enough to quiet the wind itself. "You call me savage," he said, "but what I saw in this town was a man whipping a woman to prove he owned her soul. If that is civilization, then may the mountains remain wild forever." His words cut sharper than any blade. The preacher's eyes dropped. The sheriff turned his face away, and the gathered townspeople fell silent. "You say she defied the law," he continued, his gaze fixed on the judge, "but there is no law holier than mercy, no man cleaner than one who stands in front of pain instead of behind it." The air grew thick, the last drops of rain sliding from the leaves above like tears that belonged to no one and everyone. "If you must punish," he said, "then strike me again. But if you truly believe in your God, look at her and see that he already did, through me." The judge stumbled backward, his voice cracking into a whisper. "This is blasphemy." But the people did not agree. One by one they began to lower their hats, not to the judge, but to the warrior who had given them back their conscience. Even the preacher, trembling, raised his Bible and said softly, "Maybe the Lord sent him to remind us of the words we forgot." The sheriff stepped forward and unhooked the whip from his belt, holding it out to Clara with both hands. "No more," he said, and dropped it at her feet. The judge turned to leave, his authority broken by the very silence he once used to command obedience. Toby turned to the crowd, his breath uneven, but his eyes bright with the kind of strength that doesn't need victory to stand tall. "The day you stop seeing her as a sin," he said, "you'll start seeing yourselves as men again." Then he walked away from the square, not triumphant, not proud, but free in a way that no law could ever cage. Clara followed, her steps quiet beside his, and for the first time in that town's history, the square stayed silent, not from fear, but from the sacred weight of respect. They left the town behind before sunset, the road winding through fields washed clean by the rain, the air still heavy with the scent of wet earth and redemption. Clara rode behind Toby on a borrowed horse, her arms around his waist not for safety, but because she feared what would happen if she let go. His back, though scarred and raw, was steady, his breathing deep like a man who had carried the world and finally decided to set it down. They reached a small cabin near the edge of the forest, where the trees grew thick and the sound of the river softened the air. He dismounted carefully, wincing at the pull of half-healed wounds, and she helped him inside, lighting a fire that glowed against the wooden walls. For hours she worked in silence, grinding herbs, changing his bandages, letting her hands learn the shape of his pain until it became something she could understand. When she finished, he sat up, his eyes following her as though memorizing proof that she was real. "You should leave before morning," he said quietly. "The judge will not forgive." She met his gaze, unflinching. "Then let him carry the weight of his own shame." "I'm done carrying fear." He said nothing, only watched the flames dance, his face lit in gold and shadow. "You gave your back for me," she whispered. "Now let me give you peace." He shook his head. "Peace is not given," he said. "It's built." She reached for his hand and placed it over her heart. "Then we'll build it here." The fire crackled softly. The river hummed beyond the walls, and the quiet between them turned from awkward to holy. When dawn touched the horizon, she was still sitting beside him, half asleep, his head resting near her shoulder. She could feel the warmth of his breath, the rhythm of his survival. In that moment she realized that love, when born from sacrifice, carried no promises. It simply existed, steady and strong as the land beneath them. Outside, the world began to wake again, unaware that somewhere between the town's cruelty and the wilderness's mercy, two broken souls had found the courage to forgive everything that had once tried to destroy them. Spring returned like a promise the earth finally decided to keep. The fields green again, and the river wide with meltwater, carrying away the last traces of the winter that had nearly buried them both. Months had passed since the day Clara and Toby left the town, months of quiet healing and rebuilding, of learning that peace was not a moment but a practice, one scar at a time, one sunrise after another. They built a small home where the pines met the valley, teaching the nearby settlers and tribes to trade instead of fight, to listen instead of fear. Word spread through the territory about the woman who refused the whip and the warrior who took it for her, and by the time they returned to town, even the dust on the road seemed to pause to see what history was walking its way. The square was different now, no longer a place for punishment but for gathering, a wooden platform raised for voices instead of pain. Judge Marrow was gone, stripped of his title and moved west where no one cared about his laws. The preacher, older now, greeted them at the edge of town with tears in his eyes. "The Lord's house has walls," he said, "but mercy has none. You both taught us that." That day the people gathered, not to witness shame, but to witness a union. Clara stood in a simple white dress, the same shawl she once tore to clean his wounds now draped over her shoulders, and beside her stood Toby, tall and solemn, his scars faint silver lines against sun-browned skin. There was no gold, no music, only the sound of the river in the distance, and the hush of a crowd that had forgotten how to hate. When the preacher asked if anyone objected, not a voice rose. The sheriff, standing near the front, placed a box at their feet. Inside was the old whip, coiled like a dead snake. "We thought you might want to bury it," he said. Toby nodded and pressed his hand over Clara's. Together they walked to the corner of the square, dug a shallow grave, and laid the whip inside. The preacher whispered a prayer, but it was Clara's voice that carried. "This town once taught fear louder than faith," she said, "but today it learns that love never needs to raise its hand." When they stood again, the crowd broke into quiet applause. No cheers, no spectacle, just the sound of hearts releasing old ghosts. As dusk fell, rain began to mist again, soft and forgiving, and when Clara looked at Toby under that gentle light, she knew that every lash, every scar, every silence had led them here, to a love born not of rescue, but of shared redemption, the kind strong enough to rebuild even the places where humanity had once forgotten itself. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had seen him step between her and the whip, Would you have had the courage to take even one strike for someone else? Tell us in the comments below.